Welcome to the Reasonable Christianity Podcast, a weekly podcast where you get to discover the truth claims, teachings, and practices of Christianity. Here's your host, Roland. Well, hello there and welcome back to the Reasonable Christianity Podcast, a podcast where we invite you to consider the truth claims, teachings, and practices of Christianity. Okay, so in today's episode, we continue forward with the topic, what is truth? Now, just by way of reminder, in the previous episode, we spoke a little bit about the fact that there are two kinds of truth claims. There is subjective truth claims, which are opinions or preferences, and they are grounded in the subject. And then there are objective truth claims, which are grounded in the object of the claim, okay? We also spoke a little bit about the fact that there's a difference between a truth claim and an established truth, or verified truth. And the difference usually is evidence. And then we spoke about the fact that all truth claims fall into at least one of these four categories. They are material, mental, metaphysical, or moral truth claims. Okay, now let's see if we can maybe remember the principles we spoke about in the previous episode. I'm going to make a statement, and then we will determine if that statement is a objective or a subjective truth claim, okay? So here's the statement. The statement is, I, Roland Albertus, think I am a man. Now let's remember our training from the previous week. The first thing we need to do is to establish if this is an objective or a subjective truth claim. Can you guys remember how we go about doing that? First, we ask the question, can I change the claim by changing my view? Now, the answer in this case is yes. The claim is, I think I am a man. So tomorrow I might think I'm not a man, so I might change my view. Therefore, this is an example of a subjective truth claim about a material or physical thing, because I, as a human being, am a physical thing. Now, let's consider a slightly different claim. Let's change the claim a little bit. The claim is, let's change the claim to say, I, Roland Albertus, am a man. This is a different claim, okay? Again, we must ask the question, can I change the claim by changing my view? The answer in this case is no. This is not a claim about what I think I am. This is a claim about what I actually am. I either am a man or I am not. My perception of what I am does not determine what I am. I am what I am whether I know it or not, and I am what I am whether I like it or not. Therefore, the claim, I, Roland Albertus, am a man, is an objective claim about a material thing. Okay, now as I stated in the previous episode, once we have determined if a claim is objective or subjective, as well as the truth category into which it belongs, the only thing left to do is to determine if the claim is actually true. This is what today's episode is about. So the question for today is, how do we go about determining if a claim is true or not? But before we answer that question, in the previous episode I promised that we will deal with the objections that people give for objective truth. So we're going to look at those objections real quick, and then we're going to deal with them decisively, okay? So let's remind ourselves just what the objections are. There are four basic objections that people make when it comes to objective truth. First, there is no truth. Second, all truth is relative. Third, you can't know the truth. And fourth, there is no objective truth. Now, if you've been following along and if you've grasped the concepts that we've been sharing so far, you will realize that there's one common flaw that all these objections share. The common flaw is the fact that they are all objective truth claims. Therefore, they are self-defeating because they violate what is known as the law of non-contradiction. So what is the law of non-contradiction? The law of non-contradiction is one of the laws of logic, okay? The laws of logic are inherent laws that direct and restrain all rational discussions. These laws, like the laws of nature, like gravity or electromagnetism, These laws affect and govern our experience of reality, whether we know about them or not, okay? They are discovered by us. They are not created by us. So the laws of logic are particularly important in enabling us to make sense of reality. There can be no science without the laws of logic. There can be no effective communication without the laws of logic. There will be no way to discover, understand, or communicate truth without the laws of logic. So we need to ask ourselves the question, what are the laws of logic? And there are three fundamental laws of logic. First, there's what is known as the law of identity. So simply put, the law of identity states that things are what they are. This means that each thing, be it a universal or a particular thing, is composed of its own unique set of characteristics, qualities or features. So basically, for example, I am a human being. So as a human being, I have certain characteristics that make me different from a zebra, for example. A zebra has other characteristics that makes it a zebra. So when we consider the law of identity, it means that two entities are considered to be identical if they share the same properties. And they are considered not to be identical if they do not share the same properties or characteristics. This is one of the reasons why transgenderism, or the idea that a man can become a woman, fails, okay? Because men have certain characteristics that make them men, and women have characteristics that define them as women. These characteristics are not a matter of opinion. They can be verified by looking at the chromosomal structure, genitals, and reproductive systems of individual humans, okay? The second law of logic is what we call the law of the excluded middle, okay? This law states that a statement is either true or false. For any proposition, either that proposition is true or its negation is true. There is no middle position. For example, the claim that a statement is either true or false is either true or false. There's no middle ground, okay? Then the third law of logic is the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction states that A cannot be A and non-A at the same time, in the same way and in the same sense. Basically, all that means is two contradictory statements cannot be true in the same sense at the same time. For example, a person cannot be a man and a woman in the same sense at the same time. That's a contradiction, okay? Okay, now let's look at the objections to objective truth, and then we apply the laws of logic to them to see how they stand up to scrutiny, okay? First objection, there is no truth. So if someone says there is no truth, we have to ask them, is that true? If the claim there is no truth is true, then there's at least one truth. And if there's at least one truth, then the claim there is no truth is false. Second objection, all truth is relative. So when a person says all truth is relative, it is the same as saying everyone has their own truth. Like I mentioned in the previous episode, people base their perception of truth on their experiences, and since all of our experiences differ, it means that our truths will differ, okay? Now, there's a nice clip by Dr. Frank Turek where he deals with the fallacy of this objection.
Actually, there's a more fun way to deal with it. If somebody says it's true for you but not for me, say, sure, go try that with your bank teller. Go to your bank teller one day and say, I'd like $100,000 out of my account. Bank teller looks at your account and says, I'm sorry, you only have $47.12 in your account. And you go, that's true for you, but not for me. Give me the 100 grand. Now, if it's true for you, it's true for everybody. When it's a truth that refers to its referent, and that's true for religious claims as well. If it's true that God exists, that's true for everybody, whether you believe it or not. If it's true that Jesus rose again for the sins of the world, that's true for everybody, whether you believe it or not.
That's a funny example. Okay, we see this a lot in our culture today. Proponents of feminism, and particularly those supporting the LGBT community or movement, are often encouraging one another to live their truth. The problem is, if all truth is relative, we have to ask the question, is that true for everyone? If it is true for everyone, then the statement, all truth is relative, is false. Because if it's true for everyone, then it is an objective truth claim. Conversely, if the statement all truth is relative is false, then it proves that at least some truths are not relative. There are at least some objective truths. Either way, it's a contradictory statement. Third objection, you can't know truth. So some people will go as far as to say that while there might be something akin to objective truth, no one can really know what truth is. So they would object by saying, you can't know truth. To that objection, we must simply ask, is that true? Is it true that we can't know truth? Because if it's true that we can't know truth, then there is at least one truth that we can know. The statement that we can't know truth, okay? And if there's at least one truth that we can know, then the statement you can't know truth is false. You see how this works? We just apply the claims to themselves, and then they fall apart because they are contradictions. Fourth objection. There is no objective truth. Some people might concede that there is truth, just not objective truth. They might say something like, there is no objective truth. This begs the question, is that true for everyone? If the claim, there is no objective truth, is true for everyone, then the claim, there is no objective truth, is an objective truth, which again would make the statement false. Now listen to this clip from Cloud Atlas, which gives us some insight into the nature of truth.
Remember, this is not an interrogation or a trial. Your version of the truth is all that matters.
Truth is singular. Its versions are mistruths.
Truth is singular. Oh, I love that. Let's maybe add one more objection to the list. These days, I find people that would say that only science can give us objective truths. To this, we need to ask the question, is the claim that only science gives us objective truth, is that a scientific truth? No, it's not. You can't prove that claim in a lab because it's a philosophical claim, okay? So when presented by objections like these, Christian apologists point out that saying there is no truth is like saying, I don't speak a word of English. You must use English to say it. So when you say, I don't speak a word of English, you are using English to say that you don't speak a word of English. The statement refutes itself. Okay, so now that we've established that objective truth claims do exist, we turn to the all-important question. What is truth? There's a basic definition of truth that philosophers would use. They would say truth is what corresponds to reality, or truth must match its object, or they would say truth is simply telling it like it is. Okay? This is a fundamental understanding of truth. However, there's a little bit more to that. So here's a clip by the late philosopher Ravi Zacharias to help us nail down a more complete definition of truth.
So truth is primarily a property of proposition. But here's an important thing. There are two tests for truth. One is called the correspondence theory. The other is the coherence theory. Correspondence applies to particular statements. If you're accused of, say, committing a murder, and you stand in a courtroom and say, that is impossible for me to do that. I happened to have been in Boston when this event took place, somewhere in New Delhi or whatever. It is impossible for me to have done this. You are at that point defending your innocence on the basis of a particular statement which corresponds to reality. But then the attorney accusing you will not just look for the correspondence of your statement to reality, they will look for the coherence of the accretion of statements that you have given to state your innocence. So truth has the correspondence theory to it and the coherence theory to it. Both of these have to converge. How do we know when something is true? We apply the correspondence and the coherence, and philosophers will push it even further. They believe it has to be logically consistent, empirically adequate, and experientially relevant.
Okay, so the best way to define truth is in the form of two main theories, okay? And these theories are often expanded on by applying three tests for truth. So the theories are the correspondence theory as well as the coherence theory. So what does that mean? The correspondence theory states that a proposition, which is a statement or assertion that expresses a judgment or opinion, so a proposition is true if it corresponds to reality. For example, if I were to say I, Roland Albertus, am a man, the statement would be true if and only if I am in fact a man. Okay? So it has to correspond to reality. Then the second theory is the coherence theory. The coherence theory dictates that when we look at a set of facts regarding a particular claim, then those facts must cohere, which is to say, they must be logical and consistent in order for them to be true. For example, I had a colleague who had the habit of embellishing stories. So one time he told me that he was a manager at a factory. When I asked him when this was, he said it was from 2013 until 2015. On another occasion, he told me that he was a sniper in the South African Navy for the entirety of 2013. I remember thinking, that doesn't make sense. How could you be a manager at a factory and serve as a sniper in the South African Navy during the same time? His claims were incoherent, which is to say they were logically inconsistent. So it's likely that they were untrue. You see how the coherence theory works? Okay. Now, as Ravi mentioned in the clip, there are 3 tests that we can employ to establish correspondence and coherence. Okay, they are logical consistency, empirical adequacy, and experiential relevance. So what does logical consistency mean? It means just what we mentioned earlier. When we are testing for logical consistency, we want to see, does the claim make sense? Does the claim violate any of the laws of logic? Are things defined correctly in the claim? Are there any contradictions in the claim? And are the arguments sound? Okay? Under empirical adequacy, we ask the question, are there any empirical evidences to substantiate the claim? By this, we want to know, are there any verifiable observations apart from just logic that corroborates the claim? Under experiential relevance, the test asks, how does this claim have any relevance to an individual's life? So when a claim is experientially relevant, it means that it has real-life implications and practical significance. To be clear, I need to mention this. Personal experience is not the standard for objective truth. However, there is a deeper meaning and significance to truth that is lived out rather than truth that is just thought out. This is particularly true for truths regarding worldviews or belief systems. A person is generally more willing to suffer and even die for a truth that they have experienced. But we will talk about this a bit later when we consider why Jesus' disciples were willing to die for their claims about the resurrection, okay? Okay, now at this point, I think it's important to emphasize the fact that different academic disciplines have different methodologies for determining truths. So let's take philosophy, history, and science, for example, because they relate specifically to the truth claims that we will consider in the episodes to come. So first, the philosophical method. So philosophy is devoted to the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence. Philosophers tend to provide their evidence in the form of logical arguments. So arguments, this is how the logical argument works. An argument is a set of statements, or they are called premises, that work together to support another statement, which is the conclusion. For example, Statement 1 or premise 1. All South Africans are humans. Statement 2 or premise 2. All humans are mortal. Statement 3 or conclusion. Therefore, all South Africans are mortal. If it's true that all South Africans are human, and it's true that all humans are mortal, then it necessarily follows that all South Africans are mortal. You see how our philosophical arguments work. So if the first 2 premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. Then there's a scientific method. The scientific method, or the scientific process, is largely based on observation and experimentation. So typically scientists would observe something, then ask questions or do research, then they would formulate a hypothesis, they would do an experiment, They would reach a conclusion and then they would publish the results. That's the scientific method. Then there's the historical method. So the historical method involves compiling all the relevant primary sources regarding a person or event in the past, and then critically analyzing the data to confirm and write accurate histories, okay? So historians typically use three kinds of sources in the consideration of historical data. They use written documents, like letters, diaries, official records, and manuscripts. They use oral traditions, like oral histories, myths, legends, and songs. And they use material culture, like artifacts, architecture, tools, and physical remains. Now, as you can see, each of these disciplines have their own area of focus. And while they might overlap in some instances, there are some truths that can only be determined by applying the correct method of inquiry. Now, do you remember? Let's just think back to the 4 different categories of truth: material, mental, metaphysical, and moral. So obviously the scientific method is very apt for considering truth claims about physical reality or truth claims about the material world. The scientific method, however, might not be the best method to consider truth claims about events that occurred in the past, because those of events cannot be observed in the present, okay? The same goes for morality. Science might be able to tell us what people do and maybe even why they do it. But science cannot tell us what people ought to do. They can't tell us what's right and wrong, okay? And what about the existence of God? What material experiments can we conduct to determine the existence of an immaterial being? You see, so for those people who think science is the only way to determine truth, they have resigned themselves to a material worldview that cannot offer them any answers about the broader nature of reality, like the existence of God, like why we exist as humans, like how we ought to live our lives. That's important for us to remember. Now, throughout this podcast, I've used words like evidence or proof. But what do we mean by these words? I think it's important for us to define these terms. So what is evidence? Evidence refers to the available body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or proposition is valid or true. So evidence supports a claim, but may not necessarily lead to a conclusive or indisputable conclusion. In contrast, what is proof? So proof, on the other hand, is evidence or arguments that establish the truth of a statement. So proof establishes certainty and definitively confirms a claim without room for reasonable doubt. So evidence can lead to proof, but proof is conclusive, okay? Now, what I like to do is when I think of evidence or speak about evidence or proof, I like to refer to the legal system. I think it's helpful to consider evidence and proof from a legal perspective, because courtroom trials are arenas where right and wrong is debated and where we usually consider events that occurred in the past, okay? It is also an area where burdens of proof and kinds of evidence is clearly defined. So when we speak about burdens of proof, what do we mean, for example? We mean this. Any person that makes a proposition, that makes a claim, that makes a statement, that makes an assertion, has the burden to prove the truthfulness of their assertion. For example, if I claim God exists, then the burden of proof is on me to prove that God exists. Conversely, if someone says God does not exist, they have the burden of proof. You understand? So what is the burden of proof? There are actually multiple or different kinds of burden of proof, depending on what kinds of cases are being tried. But here are some common ones. The first one, I think, is the one that we know the best. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. This is the highest standard of proof in the court of law. It is a standard that is applied in criminal cases like murder. But notice something, the standard is not beyond a possible doubt. Why not? Because a person can always find possible reasons for doubt. Rather, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay? But more about this a bit later. The second standard, which is a bit lower than reasonable doubt, is clear and convincing evidence. The standard for clear and convincing evidence is that the evidence must be strong enough to cause a jury to have a clear and firm belief that the claim or proposition is true. And then the lowest form of evidence is what they call the preponderance of the evidence. The preponderance of the evidence states that it is more likely than not that a claim is true. This means that the evidence is only slightly in the favor of the person making the claim. Let's consider these standards of proof by using an example that's maybe easier for us to understand. So the Springboks played against the All Blacks in the 2023 Rugby World Cup final. If the Springboks won the game by 31 points to 11, that would be akin to reaching the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. Alternatively, if the Springboks won the game 21 points to 11, then that would be akin to satisfying the standard for clear and convincing evidence. However, the Springboks actually won the game 12 points to 11. That would be like reaching the standard for the preponderance of the evidence. Okay, makes sense? So which standard should we apply when considering whether Christianity is true? Many skeptics and atheists would insist that we use the highest possible standard. But here's a clip by a veteran trial attorney, Abdul Murray, where he argues against this logic.
Now, atheists often want to apply that level of burden of proof to claims about God's existence, that beyond all reasonable doubt. But why should we? There's no worry that something bad will happen if you believe in God based on a lower standard of proof and are wrong about his existence. There's no worry that the government will run roughshod over anyone if we don't hold Christians to a higher standard or theists to a higher standard. Is it because the claims are so incredible, maybe because they're miraculous and therefore quote-unquote extraordinary, that then leads to the mantra everyone always says, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? Now, we'll come to that in a future episode, but suffice it to say for now that this isn't why we employ different standards of proof in court. The prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone stole a car, and they have the same exact burden, the same high burden to prove that a defendant killed someone. So it isn't the consequences of the action that cause you to have a different standard of proof. A plaintiff in a civil case has the same burden of proof for a breach of contract lawsuit as she does for proving a wrongful death, that someone caused someone else's death. But in murder cases, in a criminal case involving someone's death, there's a very grave consequence. Yes, someone died. In a wrongful death case, same thing. Someone died, yet different standards of proof. Why is that? Because of the consequences to the defendant. In a murder case, if you're wrong, an innocent person goes to jail or might lose their life. In a wrongful death case, if you're wrong about it, then at most a defendant might have to pay money they ordinarily wouldn't have to pay. The consequences are the issue.
Okay, to sum it up, if I am trying to convince a person that Christianity is true, what are the consequences to that person if they don't believe me in that moment? Will they go to jail? Will the court sentence them to death? No. Generally, we can continue having the debate in the future unless one of us maybe dies unexpectedly or moves away or something like that. So, therefore, the burden of proof doesn't have to be the highest possible burden because the consequence for not believing is not so severe. Okay? Now, to be clear, I actually do believe that the claims of Christianity does meet the highest burden. But the point is, we don't have to meet the highest burden. Okay, now at this point, we need to speak a little bit more about evidence. What constitutes evidence? There are two kinds of evidence in a court of law. There is direct evidence and indirect or circumstantial evidence. Now, if I were to ask you, what do you think direct evidence is? Most people would say physical evidence like DNA or a murder weapon, something like that. But most people would be wrong. Here's a clip by cold case detective J. Warner Wallace that explains the nature of evidence perfectly.
Second thing I learned is that there really are two forms that everything falls into. All that evidence falls into two categories. And there are only two categories of evidence. The first one is pretty simple. It's what we call direct evidence. The other one is what we call indirect evidence. Not really hard to imagine those two different kinds, right? Well, what is direct evidence? Direct evidence is just eyewitness testimony, folks. If someone says to you, I need some direct evidence on this, what are they talking about? And I hear this all the time. I'm watching a series on Netflix called The Making of a Murderer. Have you guys seen that? And even the prosecutor, when talking about the nature of evidence, misuses the terms. Direct evidence is eyewitness testimony. That's all that counts as direct evidence. Indirect evidence is everything else. Well, DNA at the crime scene, that's not direct evidence. That's indirect evidence. Witnesses who can tell you what they saw the suspect do, that is direct eyewitness testimony. That's all that counts.
Oh, that's beautifully explained. Direct evidence is eyewitness testimony. Everything else is indirect or circumstantial evidence. Why? Because that evidence can be explained in different ways. Okay? You might find someone's blood at the scene of the crime, then that person can give a reason for how the blood got there. Maybe the blood got there before the crime was committed. You understand? But if someone saw him kill the victim, that's direct evidence. Let's think of the implications of this. If a person is studying the origin or the nature of the universe, for example, all the evidence that they might study, like the fossil record or something like that, those are all indirect evidences because none of us were there to witness the origin of the universe. Or the evidence, for example, that scientists produce to try and prove evolution is indirect evidence because none of us were there to observe the evolutionary process. So this applies to Christianity as well. Most of the evidence that we have for the truthfulness of Christianity is circumstantial evidence. I say most because the Gospels in the book of Acts, if proven to be reliable historical accounts, actually do contain eyewitness testimony. Now, in a court of law, these reports would be considered hearsay in the case of Mark and Luke because they were not eyewitnesses, or the court would consider them circumstantial evidence in the case of Matthew and John because they actually were eyewitnesses. And why are they circumstantial? Because we don't have access to these witnesses today. So we can't cross-examine them. We can't ask them direct questions. But we have their records and their testimony in the form of their records. So in terms of ancient history, this is the closest anyone can get to direct evidence in terms of ancient history. Now, I have to make a note here. In the American judicial system, there is a jury instruction, which actually instructs the jury. Every judge would tell the jury, listen, you are not to treat direct evidence and indirect evidence differently. They carry the same weight. But we watch TV shows, and then when the prosecutor or the defense attorney is presenting his case, he will say to the judge that the prosecutor's case is only circumstantial, as if it's not good enough. That's not how it works in actual court of law. Circumstantial evidence has just as much weight as direct evidence. Okay? That's important for us to remember. Okay, now let's return to the claim I made earlier. I, Roland Albertus, am a man. We've looked at the definition for truth. We've looked at tests for truth. We've looked at different methodologies for determining truth. We've even looked at standards of proof. Now let's apply these lessons or the knowledge we've gained to the claim that I just made. So earlier we've established that the claim, I, Roland Albertus, am a man, the claim is an objective truth claim about a material thing. Now all that's left is for us to determine if the claim is actually true. First, we must start by defining words. In order for us to know if I am a man, we need to determine what a man is. So what is a man? The dictionary defines a man as an adult male human being. This definition seems clear enough, but in today's social climate, it requires some more specificity. For example, we need to ask what is an adult and what is a male. So an adult is defined as a person who is fully grown or developed. A male is defined as relating to or being the sex that typically has the capacity to produce relatively small, usually motile gametes, which fertilize the eggs of a female. So based on these definitions, to say that I am a man is to say that I am a fully grown human being who has the capacity to produce gametes that fertilize female eggs. So I would be determined if I meet the requirements of being a man. Simple. We can employ the scientific method. So a medical doctor can simply observe my anatomy and see that I am fully grown, and I do indeed have the capacity to impregnate a woman. This is also proven by the fact that I actually have two children of my own. So therefore the claim, I, Roland Albertus, am a man, is true. And since it's an objective claim, it is true for all people of all time. It's not a matter of opinion. I can't change the claim by changing my mind. It's an objective fact of reality. Now, in terms of Christianity, as we move forward, the claims of Christianity, hopefully I'll be able to show in the following episodes, the claims about the existence of God, the claims about the historicity of the Bible, the claims about the resurrection of the Christ, the claims about the deity of Christ, these are all objective truth claims. If they are true for all people, whether they like it or not, whether we believe it or not, and even whether we know it or not. So over the next several episodes, we're going to apply the knowledge and skills we've learned in order to establish the truthfulness of these claims. Now, just looking forward to next week's episode. In the next episode, we will start to consider the question, what is God? With this question, we are going to look at the philosophical and scientific evidence for the existence and the nature of God. Okay, that's all for today, guys. But until the next time, remember, the truth matters, and so do you.